Hi, in this first part of the short lecture on assessment, I'm going to focus on summative assessment. In the middle part, we'll talk about formative assessment, what's often frequently known as assessment for learning, and then I'll say something briefly about planning for assessment and introduce the task. So, first thing I want to point out is that assessment has this fundamental role in relation to teaching and learning. Most of what we've been talking about in the longer sessions has been focused on how we plan for effective pupil learning. We've been talking about the importance of teachers understanding how pupils learn history, how they construct complex accounts of history, how they engage with historical sources of evidence, and how we set that up in the classroom. We've been talking about how we plan that, how we embed that in sequences of learning, and how we put it into schemes of work. But of course the missing bit so far has been assessment, and in a way this completes the cycle so that we can think about this as a continuous effort between our teaching, pupil learning, assessment, which is just a process by which we come to judge the effectiveness of pupil learning, which then gives us information that we can respond to in subsequent planning, which feeds into future teaching activities, which leads to successive pupil learning. So assessment is really crucial if we're going to make learning cumulative, if we're going to make it progressive over time, rather than just a series of completely separate tiny chunks that happen to be broken up into lesson size nuggets of learning. So the first thing I want to say about assessment in general is that there are all sorts of different ways in which we can think about assessment. The first distinction to make is the difference between formal and informal. So formal assessment is that which we write often in a book, that we record in a mark book or in a spreadsheet if we've moved on to an IT system. Very often formal assessment is actually called assessment, and children will know they're being assessed, and you will know you're doing an assessment task, typically at the end of term or at the end of a scheme of work. Formal assessments are often used in reporting, in departmental reports, or more frequently in end of year reports to parents. They're planned within a unit of study, they're often shared within and beyond the school. They're often used for comparative purposes so that you can rank children in the class, so that you can group the most able children together and those needing support. They're generally administered for all students, and they generally use standardized tasks or the same criteria across the whole group. Informal assessment, on the other hand, is often oral, it's often spoken. It may not be recorded. It's more likely to be integrated into the actual process of doing work rather than tacked on at the end as some separate process. It may not be used for any other purposes. So it might not be used for reporting or for holding yourself to account to other people in your department or for informing parents. It's often made up on the spot. It's responsive to the situation you find yourself in. It can be individual, or it can be aimed at groups, or it can even be part of a public engagement, a wider engagement if you're working in bigger groups or in year groups or in community projects. But it's probably more likely to be individual than comparative, so we're unlikely to use informal mechanisms to rate children against each other, and it's more likely therefore to be tailored to the individual more easily, because this is a kind of a way of that teachers use to respond to children in relation to their learning, and therefore it's flexible and adaptable. So the first thing to make clear is that when we talk about assessment, we're not just talking about the formal assessment. And what's really important, and what I'll talk about much more in the second part of the lecture, is this notion that assessment is a part of everyday teaching and everyday teacher-pupil interactions. And so we need to clarify how we think about that as assessment and how we use that as assessment in the classroom. The other thing to say about modes of assessment is that we can choose to focus on the product or the process. Again, the more traditional form of assessment that we tend to think about will be product focus. So we'll be thinking about the quality of the answer or the artifact or a presentation, something that the students have done to demonstrate their learning for us. So in art that might be a finished picture, in maths it might be their final answer, in history it might be a group talk if you've asked people to prepare a presentation on a topic that you've been studying. When we're assessing the product, it's important that we establish quality criteria in advance, and that we and the students know that that's being applied to judge that product. We can involve peer and self-evaluation, or it can just be teacher evaluation. it's relatively easy to compare products between groups, so we can compare those presentations and highlight which are better and which are worse around different criteria. And we will often encounter problems if we try and do product assessment for a group product. So if we do have 5 children presenting a project they've been working on for 6 weeks on an aspect of history, it's difficult to differentiate between them because we're just giving a product grade and not the process grade. So that leads us to the right hand column, where sometimes we want to focus on giving assessment, judgments and feedback on the process. So in those examples we looked at earlier, whereas the product in art might be the finished image, we might give feedback or make some assessment judgments on the kind of techniques children were using or the ways in which they used colour mixes according to the kinds of teaching we've been giving them. Whilst maths, we might be primarily interested in the final answer. If we focus on the process, we may be able to award some marks and some recognition for how the children have demonstrated they're working out towards that answer. Even if they get the wrong answer, they can still get some partial marks, and that's quite common in maths exams. In history, whilst we might be grading a group talk, we may also want to build in some mechanism for collecting information on the cooperative process. How well did children contribute to that process? How well did they support the group as a group working at this? So we might want to set up different kinds of processes that will give us the ability to give children feedback on the process they use to arrive at the final product. So we might discuss our expectations in advance and then we'll apply them retrospectively to the process. We may use peer and self-evaluation, and often it will be the only way to get at some of those processes. For example, if we take our history students giving presentations, it's more difficult to make comparisons as there are a lot more variables that we need to throw into the mix, and we may need to handle feedback sensitively for group work. For example, we'll need to set up structured opportunities for children to give each other feedback and for us to give them feedback, because we don't want them to over-personalise the feedback and to take it to take it as a kind of an emotional or interpersonal piece of feedback. And then the other thing to think about in terms of modes of assessment is, on the right hand side, the dominant way we think about assessment is in final assessment. So this is an examination at the end of a course. It's generally one attempt at this exam with lots of pressure, what we call high stakes assessment. We may give children opportunities to practice, but it's not absolutely necessary. In some schools they do more, in some schools they do less, and it ultimately comes down to a child's individual performance on the day at that task that's in front of them in the exam hall. If we contrast that with continuous assessment, that opens up the opportunity for us to regularly assess work and to build in staged assessments throughout the whole course. We can think about completing coursework or controlled assignments as we go through the course. We can give children opportunities for redrafting and improving work. We can give regular feedback and achievement and keep giving children feedback so they can get a sense of whether they're improving or whether they need to do more to improve. And we can begin to identify the norm or the trend in an individual's achievement, so that we may say that someone is very good at doing exams but not so good at routinely demonstrating sophisticated understandings, or more usually we might say that someone's classroom performance tends to be fairly good but they suffer in that formal high pressure exam system. So continuous assessment gives us the opportunity to make different kinds of judgments about different types of work and to use that in different ways in our teaching. So the implications of those different modes are that it's important for us to remember as teachers not to be too narrow in our choice of assessment methods. If we're clear about what we want to assess, then we should review the assessment method selected to make sure that we've got an appropriate mechanism. And we should draw on a wide variety and blend forms of assessment so that we gain insights into what pupils do and don't know, what pupils can and can't do, and what might be helping or hindering that progress, or their progress in terms of learning knowledge and learning skills. So we want to use assessment for a range of different purposes, not just to summarise learning at the end, but to feed back into that process of diagnosing how the learning is going, what more we can do to help children, and helping them to help themselves. So it's important to, before I talk about summative assessment and those kind of formal end of course assignments and tests and exams, it's important just to put that in the broader context. So as we do move into exams, the first thing to remind ourselves is that these are high stakes the rewards can be amazing and the disappointments can be literally heartbreaking. And so some people have investigated this through research over the years as to the impact of this kind of high stakes summative assessment. The benefits are fairly obvious. They raise expectations of students, teachers and parents by setting the bar high. They help teachers to focus more clearly on exactly what it is we need to help the children achieve, because these are shared criteria in an exam. They help teachers to become more assessment literate, because the exam criteria, the learning objectives are all set out, and so we can understand what we need to do to help our children to achieve it and to demonstrate their achievement. They provide us and the children with useful reference points for the start and the end of periods of schooling. So they enable us to say something about what a child has achieved at the end of school, and something in a language which is widely understood and widely comparable. So it means something to most people to say that you've passed or failed your end of school exams, to say that you've excelled or that you've just achieved the average. And then finally, it makes teachers and schools more accountable to parents and the wider public, so we can use those high-stakes summative tests to compare how effective schools are. But on the negative side of the balance sheet, they do tend to narrow and distort the curriculum. We tend to spend more time teaching the kinds of things that are on the exam in the way that they appear on the exam. They encourage students and teachers, therefore, sometimes to focus on surface learning rather than deep learning. It's enough to know enough to pass the exam rather than to really struggle to understand the depths of the subject. These exams can also create situations where students fail at an early age. Most exams are established to create a cut-off point, and students who continually fail to achieve that cut-off point can be turned off subsequent learning. They use attainment data in ways which have negative backwash, therefore, onto students and teachers. Teachers can be labelled as inadequate or as failing their students, and students can come to see themselves and others in their group as being failures, as being people who don't succeed in this kind of subject. And that leads us, as teachers often, to give undue attention to coaching pupils who are borderline at key boundaries at the expense of those below the level. So in the UK system, it's very common where a grade C is widely seen as an acceptable pass for teachers to invest a lot of time and effort in students who are predicted to get a grade D, because that's widely seen as with a small effort and a small additional achievement, the child will tip over into the valuable category of A to C grades, whereas students who are getting a grade E or an F might be seen by teachers as not being as likely to yield them that grade C and that success rate, and therefore less likely to get this kind of hot housing and intensive support provided for them. So it creates an inequality between students and between students in terms of the teaching experience they receive in school. It also increases stress and therefore damages the teaching and learning process, both for teachers and students who feel this stress in real ways, and it leads them to drive on in terms of coverage and getting notes in their book rather than having time to really stop and think and reflect on the nature of the topic they're learning. And finally, the potential value of assessment evidence to help students learn is often overshadowed by the predominance of summative purposes in the design and use of assessment activities. So assessment is simply something that comes at the end that delivers a judgment and doesn't feed directly into the process that we should all be focusing on, which is learning. So the assessment reform group, who tried to do a synthesis of all of this kind of literature, argued that testing reduces self-esteem, especially in low achieving pupils who become overwhelmed by assessments and demotivated by the constant evidence of their failure. Some low achievers can escape that vicious circle if they get high levels of support from home or school, but those who don't have very high levels of support to help them break through that cycle become victims of the constant reminder of their relative weakness and failure. High achievers, on the other hand, tend to be more persistent. They do adopt appropriate test-taking strategies, and they have a more positive self-perception than those low achievers. So this creates winners and it creates losers. And older pupils become more motivated by external grades rather than the learning process. So it's perfectly usual in exam groups to find children talking to the teacher about how to do better in the exam, what exam strategies they need to employ, rather than having deep conversations about history. So they go on to point out that older pupils are more likely to recognise grades as a reflection of their effort. Although some are cynical and resentful towards standardised tests, this creates an external locus of control where children don't feel like they're in charge of their own learning. Younger pupils, though, are more likely to link grades to external factors, or to getting practice, or to whether the teacher likes them, or whether the teacher's very good at setting exams, or whether they're in a good school or not. So it can be counterproductive for younger students. Girls experience test anxiety more acutely than boys. Feedback focusing on what needs to be done to improve can lead to greater effort, but comparative feedback can focus on grades over a depth of understanding. So we need to think about the kind of feedback we're giving children alongside regular grades. If all you do is do regular tests and give people back grades or numbers 1 to 10, then all they're doing is comparing each other, not thinking about how to improve their own performance or what went wrong in their own performance. So we need to think about the kind of quality of feedback we give children alongside these exam grades. And then pupils who have some choice over their work and some involvement in their assessment have more interest in their own learning, rather than merely focusing on whether or not their work is correct. So the more we take control away from the children, the more we divorce assessment from learning, and the more we pile the pressure on, the more likely we are to create problems for older children, for girls who experience the test anxiety more acutely, and for children who are not experiencing success in those tests on a regular basis. So there's quite a lot of risk attached to relying solely on high stakes assessment. And we have to recognise, though, that the advantages and disadvantages, we have to recognise that there are these advantages and disadvantages as teachers, and we have to incorporate that in our work. We need to consciously work to emphasise the advantages, to explain them to children, and we need to address the problems caused by high stakes summative assessment. So what the Assessment Reform Group was saying was that good teachers who are alert to these issues can, to some extent, mitigate against some of the worst side effects of relying on high stakes summative assessment, but you need to engage children in discussions about the assessment and its impact, rather than just assume that they'll be robust enough to deal with those implications. So one way we can do it is to try and make the exam less daunting. Various advice in the literature about this. One thing we can do is deconstruct assessment objectives in the exam specification and assessment criteria so that we can present it to children in language they can understand. So don't just photocopy the exam specification, but turn it into child-friendly language so they really know what it means. We can use those criteria routinely in the classroom so that they become familiar with them. So we need to make them available, teach them explicitly, ask students to discuss their work in relation to those criteria so they start to get used to applying those criteria and making quality judgments. We can then ask students to review each other's work, and we can give feedback using the terms in the criteria. So we need to use these criteria so the children come to understand what the exam is and how it works and how the examiner allocates marks, so there's no mystery, so that people do feel that they're in control of this. They don't feel that there's some external locus of control, but they feel an internal locus of control. They know what to do in that context. Another thing we do, obviously we do this frequently anyway in teaching, is to use practice exam questions as a regular part of our teaching so that students become familiar with representing their understanding in the required form of writing. And we can also discuss exam strategy explicitly with children. Talk to them about, if you've got an hour-long exam paper and it's got 6 questions and the last 2 are worth 60% of the marks, talk to them about a strategy for marking, identify how much time goes with questions that attract so many marks. So, and alongside that, we might use trigger words to help children decode exactly what they're being asked to do in the exam. Because sometimes that formal language in the exam deters children from demonstrating what they really understand. So here are some examples taken from Rob Phillips' book again, where he gives these as trigger words that frequently crop up in examination papers, and his translation, if you like, into child-friendly language. He says when an exam question asks you to analyse, what it's really saying is break it into parts, explain those parts and show links between them. When it says compare, they mean find similarities, and contrast, find differences. When it says discuss, it's really asking you to give reasons for and against. When the examiner asks you to evaluate, what they're asking you to do is make judgments using evidence. If they ask you to explain something, they're asking you to clarify it, to expand your explanation. And if they ask you to show something, then they're inviting you to use examples to illustrate. Now, those are taken from English exam specifications that Rob Phillips was familiar with, and he wrote his book in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I believe. So you'd need to be able to check those kinds of words against the exam syllabus and the exam questions that you're using and make sure that those are the right kind of trigger words for you. So by a quick analysis of past papers, you should be able to come up with these kinds of examples and then put them on display and give children opportunities to practice and use them, to review them before they hand in work, and then you give them feedback in relation to these. Another way in which we can make exams less daunting is by really seriously building in strategies for thinking about revision. So revision isn't just reteaching content previously covered just before the exam. You can prepare for revision as you work through a topic, summarising information in an accessible form, noting key words, analysing key concepts, or creating timelines to summarise the overview of periods that you've studied. And it's important, I think, to plan that into each scheme of work. So if you're doing an exam syllabus, typically that would be divided up into several topics. For each topic, you should prepare your revision cards, your revision notes, your revision timelines, your concept maps as you teach, and certainly before you leave the end of that unit, so that the children have their revision material filed away. It's much more difficult to come back to a topic you studied a year ago and start preparing revision notes for it. That also means that we need to plan revision time into the course plan overall, and we need to think about opportunities within that revision time to practice exams, to give feedback, and to give children, and this is the crucial bit, opportunities to respond to the feedback they've got on practice exam questions and to improve their answers, so they at least have had some experience of producing answers which attract higher marks, so they begin to understand what it is to present work of that quality. Now, I've found in my own teaching that revision cards are very useful to focus on key people, events, dates and places, for example. And what I tended to do with large topics that spanned a whole term or more was to compile revision cards as we go and then practice using them to respond to exam questions. So an example would be if we used to study Nazi Germany between 1933 and 45, and there are so many people and places and key events that you had to remember in order to take that information into the exam. So we used to have piles of cards about people, places and events. The students completed cards as they went, and then they would have these piles to sort out, and then I would give them practice exam papers, and the first task they would do is identify which of their revision cards were relevant to answering that exam paper. And the first conversation we'd have in class is, which cards have you chosen and why have you decided that they are the most relevant ones? And then they can have that conversation about, well, what does this question really ask you? What kinds of information would be interesting? And then they can go on and plan their actual response and then submit it for marking and then improve it after you've given them feedback. But I think revision cards really help them to be explicit about what kind of knowledge are you going to draw on as being relevant to answer this question, given the whole range of things you've studied when you've looked at that period of time. And then the last thing to say about revision is it's important to be specific, to set children clear tasks and challenges, like creating resources or creating a timeline. It's always difficult, I think, for children who don't understand how exams work, just to give them time or a homework to go away and prepare some revision notes. I think being explicit and clear with them about what kind of revision notes are useful and what kind of revision tasks are helpful to prepare for the exam is really important. And obviously you as a teacher have that expertise to draw on that they simply don't have. So if we come to the end of this first section, we need to think about how we design tests and tasks. The first question to ask ourselves is the thing we're designing valid? Does it test out what it sets out to? Will it enable all the pupils to demonstrate their subject understanding, or will it merely reflect their literacy, for example? And does our test relate adequately to the taught course? Has our teaching enabled pupils to access the levels possible in this test or task? So does it fit what we have taught? And clearly the best way to ensure that that fits is to plan the test at the same time as you're planning the teaching. It's poor practice to teach and then construct a test at the end of your teaching to capture what you've done, Much better to start with a clear idea of what you want them to achieve at the end, and then plan your teaching to fill in the gaps to get them there. And then the second question to ask ourselves is the test reliable? Are the results accurate, and are they a truthful reflection of the pupil's abilities? If I marked a test after you'd marked it, would we come to agreement on what it was, or does it require you to make partial judgments? In other words, are those exams consistent and replicable? For exams, teachers might reckon on using predictability as a measure of this, and if exams are consistent and replicable, then it should be possible for you, when you've understood how the exam works, to make fairly accurate predictions about how your children would do on the final examination. Now here's an example that I've taken to finish up with from the internet, because it demonstrates to us how that we can write tests, mark them with some agreement from people in the department, and then record the outcome of the test in our mark book, but it doesn't mean that we've done anything meaningful around assessing student learning. So here's a picture which has been floating around on the internet for a few months. Certainly I've been seeing it crop up in different places over the last few months. Take a moment to have a look at this. I mean, this clearly works if you are using science education to promote a literal interpretation of the Bible. But what most people who discuss this online are arguing is that the child has got 100% and an A star or an A plus. So they've got full marks, but as a scientific question, or as a scientific test of knowledge, then they have failed to understand the claims of science. So here's a good example of a mark that would go in a mark book. A very happy student who's been told they're an A plus student, but there's a fundamental mismatch between what this purports to assess and what it actually assesses. And that's what's fueling the discussion on the debate. So it's just a useful reminder for us that the form of testing and assessment and record keeping is relatively easy. The problem is to make sure that it is valid and that it's reliable and that it really gives us a way to assess the information, the knowledge and understanding and skills that the children have acquired over time. So that said, in the next part of the lecture, I'll move on and think about how we use assessment in everyday teaching and learning practices in the classroom, what we're calling formative assessment or assessment for learning.